impressive list full of personalised parking places. Happy days. Anyway, it is wonderful to see everything. And our president, Dr. John Dean, will shortly be introducing our speaker. I'm just here to say something quickly about it. I'm Jonathan Van Tam, by the way, Honorary Secretary of the Medical Society, and consultant in this hospital. 7 years ago, exactly, since I retired. Plymouth Medical Society is one of the oldest medical societies in the country. Of the provincial society, there's only one older than us, and that's Colchester. This society was formed in 1794 and initially meet on a Friday night at 7 o'clock on the Friday nearest to the full moon, so people can find their way home in the dark. It was 7 o'clock at night, Friday, but so the tradition continues. We are really thrilled that this is taking place in collaboration with the Peninsula Medical School, for which many thanks for the collaboration, for setting up the Zoom. The first time we've had a hybrid meeting, and I think this is definitely going to be the way forward, and we look forward to further collaborations. Just housekeeping, the unlikely event, there's a fire alarm. Obviously, you can go out through there, or we can go out from here. And then after the meeting is over, we can make our way across. If you want to come to the John Bull building, it's just barely 5 minutes walk, where there will be a buffet supper, which is free, and you don't need to book. So if you fancy coming over and having a little bit more social intercourse, and frankly, you're all very welcome. So that's quite enough from me. Except to say, lastly, the Peninsula Medical Foundation, and this was set up by doctors and local businessmen to foster research, medical research in Plymouth, in collaboration with the medical school. So there are lots of forms outside, and we are going to the Medical Society also to promulgate all the Peninsula Medical Foundation news. And bottom line is they'd like your money. And we think it's a very worthy cause we should all be supporting. Thank you. President.
Refreshingly honest. Thank you. Well, we still have a couple of minutes to 7. So as there are going to be a number of people joining us on Zoom, I think out of respect for them, please talk amongst yourselves for another couple of minutes, and we'll pick up when the big hand is pointing straight up. Nice. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. My name, as Jonathan alluded to a few moments ago, is John Dean. It's my pleasure to be the president of the Medical Society, and this is a splendid finale to the academic programme during my presidency. It won't be the last meeting because I haven't sprung it upon you all yet, but there is going to be a barbecue which will be later in the summer. This is a very special meeting, and it's my privilege and indeed my pleasure to welcome this evening Professor Sir Jonathan Van Tam to the joint event with the medical school and our society. Jonathan is a public health specialist with a clinical background in emergency medicine, anaesthesia, and infectious diseases. He is an expert, as you may have noticed, on respiratory viruses and pandemics. He is, until the end of May, Pro-Vice Chancellor, Faculty of Medicine and Health Sciences of the University of Nottingham. His career has also taken him into Public Health England, the World Health Organization, and the pharmaceutical and vaccine industries. Jonathan was seconded to the Department of Health and Social Care between 2017 and 2022 as Deputy Chief Medical Officer. He is well known for his leadership role during the COVID-19 pandemic, particularly his straight, no-nonsense communication style from the podium at 10 Downing Street, and for the acquisition and rollout of vaccines and antiviral drugs for the UK. He's since written about some of his experiences in a national newspaper. It was like being on a war front for 2 years, and I've struggled transitioning away from that and getting used to ordinary university life again. When lockdown rules allowed, he was able to escape the extraordinary pressures of his role to find tranquility in shore fishing on the Norfolk coast, and probably a touch of frostbite. What did he miss most? Watching Boston United on a Saturday afternoon. Another Pilgrims, by the way, folks. But ordinary may prove elusive to him. He was awarded the Royal Society's Attenborough Award and Lecture in 2022 for outstanding public engagement in science. He received a knighthood from our late Queen Elizabeth in her 2022 New Year's Honours List for services to public health. Memorable and extraordinary for us, he will speak to us this evening on science and leadership during the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic. Sir Van Tam.
President, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for inviting me this evening, and thank you for your warm welcome. John very kindly pointed out that my secondment to the Department of Health 2017 to 2022. In fact, the first secondment was for 2 years, and Dame Sally then said to me, well, we kind of like you and you kind of like us, I think. Why don't you stay for a bit longer? Why don't you sign on this bit of paper for another 3 years? That was in October 2019. It was not necessarily the best career move I ever made, but there we are. Thank you. So, now, how's this work? I'll do it from here, that's fine. So I'm going to run for about 45 minutes, and in that time hope to take you through perhaps a different perspective on the largest and arguably the worst public health crisis we've had in our working lifetimes. I want to give you some insights, if I can, into how science, clinical stuff and political leadership all interplayed in different ways. And I want to offer you just a few reflections on the future, particularly for the younger healthcare workers in the audience. And of course, as Downing Street know, the views expressed are always of my own and not necessarily those of His Majesty's government. So I want to begin at the beginning and say that we have been, as society in the UK and around the world, preparing for influenza pandemics for really several decades now. And of course, what has happened is that we've had a pandemic related to a non-influenza virus in the form of a coronavirus. Was that right or was that wrong? Well, obviously the inquiry will have a little look at that, I'm sure, but it is fair to say that we've historically had 3 respiratory virus pandemics of the 20th century, all influenza. We've had 1 influenza pandemic already in the 21st century, and so I don't think it was wrong to have made influenza the main focus of pandemic preparedness. But if you go back to 1918, there were 198,000 excess civilian deaths in Britain over the estimated period of that pandemic. If you go fast forward then to our SARS-CoV-2 pandemic that we just lived through, at the midpoint, so mid-2021, excess deaths in England and Wales had reached 98,000. Eventually they reached 137,000, so we had a slightly happier ending. But if you think about it, 98 being roughly 50% of 198, you can see that this was a seismic event that was on the same scale, broadly speaking, of the 1918 pandemic, rather than on the scale of the 57 or the 68 or the very weedy 2009 pandemic. And one of the things that has really emerged from the world literature and the WHO's analysis is that if you look at the first 2 years of the pandemic and you count COVID-19 confirmed deaths, you get this pattern that's represented by the grey part of this graph. And it amounts to almost 5.5 million certified COVID deaths around the world in that first 2 years. But if you then look at the green curve, you can see that excess mortality soon rose and has remained very high. And typically the figure is about 3 times higher over that period, suggesting that probably the death toll from this pandemic in the first 2 years of it around the world has been closer to the 15 million mark than the 5 million. I will come back to that later. And as I've said, the inquiry is going to look in phase 1 at pandemic preparedness. And one of the things undoubtedly, and not unfairly, it will focus on is the fact that we had a near miss with a coronavirus in 2003 in the form of SARS. We had another near miss in 2013 with the MERS coronavirus, and that's still kind of bubbling away on the Arabian Peninsula every now and then. And then we've taken a really big direct hit in 2020 with another coronavirus. So I think it does raise questions about whether there needs to be more focus on coronaviruses in years to come as we think about refreshing and kind of rejuvenating pandemic preparedness. And my reflection at this point is that we certainly have to go beyond influenza. We probably have to think in terms of organisms that are not necessarily transmitted by the airborne or droplet route. And WHO remind us that there's this pathogen disease X that is out there that we just don't know anything about at the moment, but one day we will. And if you turn on the news and you think about the geopolitics that's playing out at the moment, think no further than Ukraine, Taiwan, and so forth, you realize that as in the public health world, we're going to have to build international partnerships that are capable of withstanding these kind of geopolitical shocks that I think are going to get more and more common as we go forwards. So let's go back in time to autumn 2020. This slide is from Nottinghamshire, but it could frankly have been from anywhere in the country, not necessarily bang on October 2020, but it could have been from anywhere on an acceleratory part of the epidemic curve or any part of the world. And what you can see on this slide, each vertical block is a day from late September through to late October, and each horizontal row is an age band from 0 to 15 at the bottom through to 60 plus at the top. And what you can immediately see is that this disease pops up very quickly in 16 to 29-year-olds, and that's not at all surprising given the number of social contacts per day that 16 to 29-year-olds have. And for those of you who still own them, you will already know that these teenagers do not talk to their younger siblings, and there isn't this kind of heating up in the younger age group, but there's quite a rapid encroachment into the older age groups until finally at the top right of the slide, you're getting into a position where you have a growing problem in the over 60s. And it is really that very rapid increase with doubling times in the region of 5 to 7 days at the peak that has given the enormous problems that we've had to deal with. Translate that now into lethality and think about a virus that we all recognize and have learned to live with, the influenza virus in its form of seasonal flu. And you can see, comparing in mid-2020, and this was really basically Wuhan wild type disease, possibly a bit of alpha creeping in. What you can see is that the lethality of COVID-19 in its original form and without any defenses, the lethality was probably 4 times higher in people aged 30. And by the time you get to my age, you're talking about a lethality that was 18-fold greater than seasonal flu. And that really summarizes the problem. These are all based on ONS data, but it summarizes the problem that we were facing. We had something that was coming at us very rapidly indeed, something with a very high mortality burden in the over 50s, a very high hospitalization burden, not exclusively in the over 50s, but certainly dominated by the over 50s, higher than normal clinical severity once you hit the age of 30. And this is a really important point. At that point, we really had no vaccines, no therapeutics, and no idea at all when we could possibly have access to such things. And that was the really scary bit at that moment in time. Now, the politicians are very keen now to say this was a once-in-a-lifetime event, to which my reply is this may be once in a political lifetime, but in terms of the younger scientists and physicians in the room, it's definitely not going to be once in your lifetime. It will be repeated during your professional careers. I'm absolutely certain of that. And one of the things we had to get used to as a society was this notion that things were going to go badly wrong unless it was slowed down. The health service was going to collapse unless it was slowed down. And we didn't have to just put the brake on once to slow it down, because the moment it came off, we were still on that hill and it had to be put back on again. In fact, it had to be put back on 3 times before finally we could get a kind of velocity that we could live with. And that was new and shocking to people at the time. These are data from the UK waves 1, 2, and 3. What I'm asking you to look for on this, the top array are confirmed cases. The bottom array, different axes, of course, are hospitalizations with confirmed COVID-19 diagnostics. And if you look, then I put it to you that with the eye of faith, the contours, the shape, the profile of wave 2 and wave 3 are essentially the same on the top and the bottom arrays, but they are remarkably different in terms of wave 1. And the reason for that is really all artifactual. It is all about the fact that in those first months after introduction into the UK, and we can all speculate quite when that was, but in those first months of 2020, we had very little diagnostics indeed, inability to scale up to the extent that we needed to, and it wasn't particularly our problem, it was like that across the world. And we had to put the diagnostics at the doors of the hospital where people were sickest and where there was a reason, an infection control reason to understand who'd got what. And because of that limitation in diagnostic capacity, effectively we sleepwalked into a first huge community wave that undoubtedly was the same kind of size as wave 2 or wave 3 in terms of cases, but we could not detect it because we did not have the diagnostics to do so. Now, expanding that a little further, if you take that first WHO slide that I showed you, and you now chop this into blocks according to high, and then progressing to the bottom right of the slide to low-income countries, you can see in the high-income quadrant, top left, you can see this really quite tight correlation between COVID-19 confirmed deaths in the blue and excess mortality in the red, albeit on different axes. As you progress down into countries with fewer resources, you can see that that pattern disappears altogether. And that is because in those low income settings, there was never enough diagnostics. And the only way one can really start to get at what happened is by looking at excess mortality. And I'm absolutely certain that in the developing world, there were query malaria, pneumonia of unknown cause diagnoses made with people who died. And in actual fact, it was COVID-19, absolutely certain. And so the next reflection really is about diagnostic testing, how limited it was at the beginning, how we need excess mortality as an epidemiological tool to get to the truth of this, how if we have a further problem, we need to be able to rescale diagnostics to understand what is going on again. And I think until the variant question is fully settled, and fully is a word I've added to this slide as time has gone on, I can't quite tell you when, but I think I'm more settled about variants than I was 6 months ago or 12 months ago. But until the variant question is fully settled, I just don't think we can yet rule out the fact that we might need to resurge diagnostic capacity. And so for the kind of public health policy space at the time, what we were dealing with was a situation where we had not much data, very low public health certainty, very low clinical certainty because no one had treated this disease before, and really vaccines that might be many years away. We just didn't know. And the public health imperative was to stop the NHS from getting to a position where a message would have to go out that certain sectors of society could not come forwards for hospital admission. And that was talked about. It was talked about that there could be certain sectors of society who could not come forwards for hospital admission because there wouldn't be the space and we would be too busy treating people more savable, if that's the right word. And it was a desperate shock to society, and particularly to the younger echelons in society, when the lockdowns and the social distancing happened. But if you go back to not very far, to the Ebola outbreaks in DRC, in the absence of vaccine, you keep people in their own homes, you stop travel, and you stop villages from mixing. If you go back to the cholera outbreaks in the 1860s in Europe, there are quarantine centres and isolation centres at the borders. There are travel restrictions. And all of this is old hat, really, in terms of human history. And if you go back to the Plague of Athens, there's lots of talk about isolation of the sick, about quarantine, and the first observation that physicians who've caught the disease from their patients and survived can then be safely put back in to treat more, and that somehow they are magically protected. So all of that's there in the historical writings. And so actually the social interventions, whilst a shock to us, really are as old as the hills. And over time, the situation changes. You get lots of data. You eventually have specific medicines, you have specific vaccines, and all of a sudden, you can allow the clinical interventions to do the heavy lifting for you, and you can relax or remove the social interventions. The health service is still under pressure, but it's not at risk of overwhelm in the same way. And that was the journey that, as kind of public health policy people in the centre, we knew that journey had to happen. We just didn't know the timing of it. And the trick was to help politicians manage that journey at a pace that was least injurious to society, not too fast, not too slow. And I've realised that very wise people like Chris Whitty completely understood this from the word go. That was the transition down which we had to be led, but gradually. Now, the non-pharmaceutical interventions, I'm not going to test you on them because you've all lived them, and I'm sure you obeyed all the rules. But the Penrose Triangle really is there for a reason, because it has no solution. And imposing these restrictions on society there was no solution for ministers. It wouldn't have mattered whether it was a red, green, or yellow or blue government. There was no easy decision left on the table after about 2.5 weeks into this pandemic, just nothing left that was easy or comfortable or that didn't have a cost. And we found ourselves being asked a question about how difficult are these interventions to do, what will they cost, what will be the popular support for them, how long do we have to have them in place before we start to see an effect? All these very sensible, practical questions. And then it gets more difficult. The next question is, well, what's the size of the effect we're going to get back? And of course, it's pretty difficult to do a randomized trial of doing certain things in Plymouth and not doing them in Exeter, and kind of seeing who's got the worst case count or hospitalization count at the end of it. So you can't do these randomized trials. You fall back on observational data and on modeling to try and get you some of the answers. And then, of course, the ministers say, well, what's the strength of the evidence? How confident are you about this? And then it gets really into quite difficult territory. And finally, it's a perfectly rational political question to say, well, look, if I don't do this, what's going to happen? And what are the optics if I don't do it? Because that's a relevant consideration in the mix in terms of how you have to make these national decisions. Now, in the midst of all that came SAGE, and SAGE was there to give a kind of central scientific view to ministers, but with the uncertainty laid out carefully. And one of the really difficult things to communicate was that this is the central view of the scientists at this point, but it might change because the virus might evolve, we might get new data, and we kind of reserve the right to be wrong or to change our view later, but this is the view for now. And in a society where we don't lock people up for outrageous views or even kind of outlying views, you get perfectly reasonable scientists who come along and their voice is heard in that kind of political space of you're doing far, far too much, and also you're doing far too little. But the job of SAGE was to present the central case to the politicians. And whilst I've been rabbiting on, some of you may notice on this slide, the current Prime Minister is taller than the previous Prime Minister. And that's because he's on my box. So seriously, at number 10 Downing Street, they give me a little box. I can see over the lectern, and it makes life a lot easier. So my next reflection is that we had to make strategic decisions based on really imperfect information and an information picture that we knew was changing all the time. And somehow we had to communicate that to ministers and to the public, but not in a way that caused the public to lose hope that there would never be a way out of this, that we were locked into this cycle forever. Because as you realize now, we weren't. So it's that kind of delicate balance of not pulling a punch, not pretending to people this is going to be easy and it won't be a difficult path ahead, but giving them hope and a kind of calm confidence that it can be got through. And along the journey, one of my biggest roles was to be the clinical advisor to the UK Vaccine Task Force. And it was an absolutely astonishing piece of work that will stay with me forever. I have never experienced teamwork outside of uniform like this before. And the VTF was led by Dame Kate Bingham. Some of you will have read her book. But Dame Kate Bingham, not scientist, she's not a medic, she's a venture capitalist. And there were perfectly good reasons for choosing a venture capitalist to lead this. Somebody who understood how to invest with industry to get stuff moving really fast. Somebody who understood that in spite of the fact there was a global pandemic and it was a public health emergency, there was a commercial angle to how to get these things done. And the Prime Minister was very clear with us in terms of the Vaccine Task Force, but the Prime Minister said very clearly, your mission is to get vaccines for the UK and then for the world as fast as possible. That is it. Go and do it. And we, in turn, said, look, you have to realise we're going to have to take hundreds of millions of taxpayers' money, and we're going to have to put it very significantly at risk. And there may be many projects where we lose hundreds of millions of pounds, and we have to have the space and the freedom to do that. Otherwise, we're never going to get a shot on target. And we've got to try. And the politicians were very clear about that and really understood that that was the game we were in. And the choice of those 4 vaccine platforms was not random, nor was it kind of scientifically pure. We didn't want to go for the very best vaccine modalities if they were 5 years away. We weren't interested. We only wanted to place bets on things that could deliver in the next 12 to 18 months. And so that's what we did. And so it was really spread betting, but there was a fair degree of good fortune in the end, because all of those modalities have now delivered a licensed product. Not all in the UK, not all deployed in the UK, but they've all licensed. And so on that task force, I reflect on the fact that it just was a very clear mission. It was not business as usual. I don't think that would be sustainable forever. Normal speed for anything was not tolerated. Risk was firmly accepted. And one of the things we actually did for our membership, there were 200 or 300 people, I think, in the vaccine task force towards the end, was that we said it's okay to take risks. It's okay to fail. There's not going to be some big inquiry every time this happens, because if we don't try and take these risks, we will never succeed. And the psychological contract amongst us in the vaccine task force was something I've never experienced, again, outside of uniform. People were prepared to work all night for this, and frequently did. It was mind-blowing. And then we get vaccines, of course. The situation is starting to change. And one of the things that happened, there was pressure from lots of groups about wanting to be at the front of the queue for vaccines. And I completely get it that if you're a police officer, it's extremely unpleasant to deal with one of your customers on a Saturday night who is determined to kind of cough and spit on you on purpose. But it boiled down in the end to the fact that the only thing that was really driving mortality was age. And the politicians very sensibly and very graciously said, we're keeping right out of this. This is JCVI territory. You decide. And if you look at the red box, you can see the numbers needed to vaccinate to prevent 1 death. And it's remarkably small numbers in care home residents, in the over 80s, the over 75s, and the numbers get bigger as you go down the page. So that was what drove the decision we made. And it also drove operational simplicity, because it's really easy for the NHS just to ask you your age rather than go through your comorbidities, go through your occupation, all of this stuff. So we got all of that out of the way. Now, one of the things that some of you, and I don't know, many people did, objected to was the fact that the manufacturer's labels said, give 1 dose followed by another one in 4 weeks' time. And of course, the manufacturers could only have said that because they only had data on clinical trials where people have been given dose one at day 0 and another one at 28 days. We didn't have enough vaccine. Nobody had enough vaccine to begin with. And so the JCVI plus the chief medical officers made a very unpopular decision that people would wait 12 weeks for their second dose. And many healthcare workers kicked off about this, including the BMA. And if you look at these early data from the Siren study in the box from healthcare workers, you can see that the risk of infection lowers as the interval between first and second dose widens as you go from top left to bottom right of that array. And it shows very clearly that, frankly, if you wait longer than 12 weeks, if you delay the doses 6 months, you're going to get the very best protective effects. And you get a lot of fan mail in the job, and some of the fan mail was, you wicked doctor, why are you making me wait 12 weeks for my second dose? To which the reply that you never send is, thank you, sir, madam. Please identify somebody of a similar age to you who you would like to wait much, much longer to have even 1 dose in order that you can have your second one a bit more quickly. And it really boiled down to what we had. It was a zero-sum game, and it was about sharing. But that's how we kind of worked it through. Then, of course, we got this thrombotic signal from the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. And the worst thing we could have done was to say it wasn't real, because it was real. But the thing we did, I think, very well in the UK was to lay out the potential harms, the orange dots, versus the potential benefits in terms of ICU admissions averted in the blue dots. And it became very clear that you would certainly go down to 30 years of age with Oxford AZ, even if that was the only vaccine in town. But it wasn't, because of our spread betting. We were able to veer across into the younger age groups to the messenger RNA vaccines. But this was really badly handled in many places. And I point the finger mainly at Europe. It was really badly handled. The messages were poor. And consequently, a lot of confidence in this vaccine was lost in developing world countries, where the only vaccine they could afford was the one provided by a manufacturer at not for profit, which was Oxford AZ. And it really was quite damaging in my view. And so in December 2020, when the vaccination program opened, this was the kind of antibody profile in the population by age, running from 16 to 24 to 80 plus on the right. Now you have to watch very carefully as the date changes in the top left-hand corner. So you use your left eye for that, and your right eye used to look at the antibody profiles. These data are all from the Office for National Statistics S antibody testing data. So they are pretty reliable source of what's going on across the UK. Now the movie pauses there because you might have seen the antibody levels start to drop in the elderly around about September. In comes the booster program. And by the time we get to the point where Omicron is beginning to appear in December 2021, in terms of the UK population, we've put ourselves in really quite a strong position not to have the same kind of catastrophic problem as we had in those early days. That's just in case the first slide didn't work. And the result, the kind of clinical result is here really in hospitalization rates for confirmed COVID-19 diagnoses in late 2021, comparing by age, left to right, the vaccinated in the orange versus the unvaccinated in the blue. And that really has been the story, or the enduring story of the vaccine program so far, that there's a very substantial effect on severe disease. And as time has gone on and the variants have come along, we've had less and less effect on the occurrence of infection, but the protection against serious diseases really held up. Now, when the Omicron wave came, for those who'd had 2 doses of vaccine, we saw very quickly that protection against hospitalization started to drop and was in the kind of typically kind of 50% mark. But with a booster dose, bottom part of the slide, you see we could restore that quite quickly to 90%. But nevertheless, after just a few weeks, there is some degree of waning beginning to occur. And I think that typifies where we are now with the vaccine program, settling a bit, and I'm not privy to what's going to happen this autumn, but settling a bit into a cycle of kind of flu-like vaccination, vaccinating the at-risk in the autumn. So the kind of iceberg of disease, which had a lot of fatality and hospitalization sticking out of the water at the beginning, has been made a little bit smaller by vaccines, but it's really gone right down below the waterline, out of the zone of NHS and public health concern, or at least not to the same extent. And so really the vaccine story speaks for itself, but I want to stress that these are disease-modifying vaccines, not transmission preventing vaccines. And there is clearly a waning over time. And there are some nuances yet to come in terms of the composition of these vaccines in terms of variants. But looking even further afield, I think there are some further nuances to come in terms of what goes into particularly the messenger RNA modality. I think it's going to be feasible to add in flu and probably RSV in the future to give a kind of big three winter respiratory vaccine, but that is going to be 5 to 10 years away, I suspect. Moving on now to therapeutics. Some of you may have been consented for the recovery trials. Some of you were consented patients for the recovery trial, in which case, thank you. The story went that we needed a platform trial across the NHS. And I do remember walking down Victoria Street with a tube. And on the way, one of my last jobs was to ring Sir Peter Horby, say, Peter, we need a vaccine platform design and I need it really fast. What can you do? And I remember Peter saying, oh, give me about 10 days, you'll have something. And we moved that fast, and within another 10 days, it was all funded. And the ethics committee had happened in parallel, and we were starting to recruit patients. And it was that speed and agility which the NIHR was able to show this time that gave us this early signal in June 2020 that dexamethasone was a lifesaver, and a very important signal for developing world countries as well, where dexamethasone is a generic drug and extremely cheap. We also got some important results at the same time about hydroxychloroquine, much celebrated in other parts of the world, but not in the UK, where we stuck to our guns, did a proper clinical trial and got a proper answer that it does not affect mortality. So, you know, the countless lives were saved really by the ability of the NHS to mobilise under research and the ability of the British research system to get an answer quickly. Now, some of you will also have taken part in the panoramic trial, which is an evaluation of the new anti-COVID drugs, the COVID-specific antivirals that are already licensed by the MHRA as being safe and effective. However, the data on effectiveness have all been completed, not improperly, but all been completed in unvaccinated patients. And the question is, in somebody who has had 4 or 5 vaccines already, and I bet most of you have had at least 3 and probably 4 or 5, some of you, in that heavily vaccinated cohort, what extra, if anything, do you get back from treatment on top? And of course, the answer for molnupiravir was that you do get something back. You get a 4-day benefit in terms of time to recovery, but in terms of reduction in hospitalizations and mortality, you get nothing extra back in the vaccinated. That's not dissing the drug, that's just saying the policy relevant question is, how does this work in vaccinated people? And so my reflection here is that we have to continue to be bold next time about doing the right research, getting the right answers, and following the science to get really good policy relevant readouts. And so, of course, it comes to an end. The politicians say all restrictions will be lifted and we will go back to normal. And we all know, as scientists and medics, that SARS-CoV-2 is still with us and there's plenty of it about. Were the politicians right, though? Well, if you repeat that analysis of ONS data, keep your baseline seasonal flu, and this time fast forward to March 2022, where we have a very heavily vaccinated population. We have Omicron rather than wild type, and you can see that COVID-19 lethality is now in the same ballpark as seasonal flu. I'm not going to argue with you whether actually, you know, the precise answer is above or below the blue line. I don't think that matters. I think what does matter is that if we live in a society where contextually we accept winter flu and we accept we're just going to get on with life, then we're probably in that kind of space now with SARS-CoV-2. So that's really the end of the science. I'm just going to mop up in the last 5 or 10 minutes with just a few little bits and bobs and observations, softer observations from my time in government. The first thing to say is that being a CMO or even a DCMO, being part of that team is actually quite hard, because there is this statutory right since 1855 to be independent of government and to say what we think and to communicate directly to the public if we wish to, and it doesn't have to be the government view on anything. But of course, you're hardwired into a civil service where you're a senior civil servant, and it's most productive for the people of this country if you can advise and speak on behalf of the government. And so that's a difficult path to tread, because where possible, you want to oil the wheels of government. They are, after all, the people you elected, but reserve the right to speak independently. And I think that's been really tested in the last couple of years. But the really important thing is in those roles to remember that advisors advise, ministers decide. It doesn't matter who you vote for, put in, whether it's red, green, yellow or blue government, we will advise them as best we can. Where we can be culpable is if we don't speak truth to power, because there's a difference between a politician making a bad decision because they made a bad decision versus a politician making a bad decision because somehow you didn't deliver truth and objectivity and honesty in your advice to them. They could ignore it and make the bad decision, but you can't be culpable, can't become culpable because you failed to give the objective advice. You failed to speak truth to power, even that if that is sometimes a bit difficult to stand there and take it. It does kind of help to have been on a parade ground and you haven't taken it before now to feel you can do that. As a team, we were also really good because we understood our subject matter and we understood who was best at the different bits. We agreed that we would sort this out if we had differences, and we didn't have many clinical differences. We would always do it away from the public gaze, so that there was one final arbiter, the chief medical officer, and one version of the advice. No undermining or splitting of ranks. We stuck to strategic stuff rather than detail, because that way, you know, if you get involved in the minutiae of how it's going to happen rather than what should happen, then you can't stay focused. And we knew each other's strengths and weaknesses. We knew who was the best person to put up for certain audiences and who was not the right person to put up for certain audiences. And we took account of each other's personal circumstances. So Sajid Javid, in one of his speeches, said, I knew that on Saturday afternoon between 3 and 5 p.m. I could not get hold of JVT. If I phoned him, he wouldn't answer, or his phone might be off. If I phoned the private secretary who was on duty, there'll be some garbled excuse as to why he wasn't available until 5:15, but he called you back then. He said, I knew he was at the football, but I was unreachable at that point in time because the team knew that was my 2 hours of kind of sanctuary, normality, whatever on a Saturday afternoon. And so we did protect each other, which protected those moments as best we could. Something I learned quite mid-career really was to begin with the end in mind and not to kind of over-engineer the end, but just stick to principles. And that really helped in government because you've got to know what you want out of a political encounter before you go in. You've got to have a very clear view of the things you've got to win versus the things it'd be nice to win versus the things where you definitely got a view of what the right thing is, but actually it doesn't really matter and it's not worth putting all your political capital into. Because you haven't got infinite political capital. It comes and goes a bit, but you can't spend too much of it at once. So you need to work out which ditches you're going to die in and which ones you're not going to bother about. And, you know, I've just observed it across government. You can't defend a bad position for long. It's better just to say it's bad, pull out, come back to a more defendable place. And there's a lot of posturing and a lot of political testosterone that goes on in meetings sometimes. And sometimes just being silent and waiting for your moment is stronger. And if you can just control your breathing and just hang on and wait until you've got the perfect shot, rather than one that, you might, taken at too far a range, just wait till the enemy is completely in sight, till they're really in the kill zone, then fire the single aim shot, and you can carry the meeting. It really did help to have been all, I'm not asking you to look at my CV or anything, but I've been to a lot of different organisations, and I have to say that helped in terms of the vaccine task force work, and particularly going to the vaccine industry was a game changer for what I could actually contribute. So we get into the more light-hearted stuff now about what happened in terms of the media, and it was all by accident, and nothing prepares you for this. And though you are media tested when you go for these jobs, nothing prepares you for the kind of scrutiny of almost every aspect of your life that you get in this kind of job. But I always felt it was best to be honest and realistic with people, including your superiors. It was not my job to make things sound better or to put some kind of spin on it for somebody else's benefit. It was my job to try and maintain public confidence to the extent possible, and to explain the journey and be clear about hardship along the way, and be clear about the absence of easy quick wins, easy fixes. And that came through really when we were tested with the signal, the genuine signal from Oxford AstraZeneca. It would have been very easy to go, oh no, it's all okay. It was actually better to say that signal is real, but actually it doesn't change anything, because the signal of the way this virus can harm you is even stronger. When we get the myocarditis signal from the messenger RNA, it's best to say, yes, it's there, and it is there. But the likelihood of myocarditis is somewhere between 7 and 10-fold higher after wild-type infection than after vaccination. Unless you really believe you can avoid COVID for the rest of your life, there aren't many of us left, I'm not one of them, then you have to face the risk at some point. I found it's best to say what you mean and then live the example. I find it's best to frame an answer not in to try and be the cleverest scientist in the room, but try and be the one who can actually connect with your parents or your siblings or somebody else you know. If you dodge a question, everyone knows you're dodging it, and they just dislike you for it. So don't bother, just say what it is, and be honest, and let your integrity kind of do the rest. And finally, remember that we're physicians, a lot of us in this room are, and people out there don't have the same lived experiences as us. They don't come from the same backgrounds as us. So you've got to give people information that they can kind of make action in their own lives. So if I'm permitted to go on for another couple of minutes, I'll just tell you about the functional anatomy of the number 10 press briefing, because everyone wants to know this. So it begins with a phone call. Number 10 say, press briefing tomorrow. We would like J. Van Tam for this. Private secretaries go back, go, no, sorry, he's too busy. And number 10 comes back, no, we really want him to do this. And private secretaries go back and say, well, what is there new to talk about? What angle is there for him to talk about tomorrow? And eventually it gets down to, Minister has asked for you by name. And at that point, you can't avoid it. And then you set off this fantastic army of private secretaries in the CMO's office to get you your briefings for the next day. And they work until they've got them. It doesn't matter what time it is. And by about 8, 9 o'clock in the morning the next day, you've got this huge stack of emails and loads of stuff to read, and you can't digest it. So you just have to quickly read it and kind of make your own mind map of what's going on. Try and just pull out 1 or 2 key facts, and then get yourself on the train down to Downing Street. And on the way down, Mark always phones and gives me a very, very aggressive media interview. He's our principal private secretary in the office, but he's also got a media background. Really, really aggressive interview, horrid, in fact. You walk these things through, and it's kind of, no, I wouldn't say that. Why don't you say this? And we kind of work out, where you want to be on things. Get to number 10, find the cat. I always find the cat if I can. Sometimes he's in the garden, I can't get hold of him. But most of the time he's indoors. He's a big cat, and he's all right to stroke as long as you don't touch his tummy. Touch his tummy, he'll bite you. But a bit of fur therapy I find very calming before a gladiatorial encounter with the press. And a cup of tea. Tea, number 10, always served in bone china. Very nice cup of tea. And then, of course, at 4:30, Minister walks in with his entourage, and you're all warming up for the final event. And really, those last 30 minutes are not about you, they're about warming up the Minister. But in your head, you're working out, where is the point where you're going to step in and say, I'll take that because it's science, don't embarrass yourself. And the point where you're going to go, I'm not taking that because it's politics, I don't want to embarrass myself. So you have to kind of work that out. And then, of course, you go in there, you don't know which journalists are going to be in there, you don't know what questions they're going to ask you. So it is quite gladiatorial, and you have to be absolutely on it for those 45 minutes. Then, unless there's a party, get yourself home and relax. No, seriously, never went to a single. And then on leaving the HSC, well, I announced I was leaving on the 3rd of January, and Partygate broke on the 4th of January, I think you'll find. And there was a lot of association made by the media, but none of it's true. I had planned that I was leaving at least 3 months in advance, and that date was planned long ahead of time. And why did I leave? Well, I just kind of felt I'd run my course and done what I had to do. We went on holiday to Inverary, to St Conan's Kirk, in the next block, a lovely little chapel on the shores of the lake. And there's a knight who's died there. I think he built the place, actually. And the 3 stained glass windows say, I fought a good fight, which I translated to modern day parlance of, look, I've put in the best effort I can. I finished my course. That has nothing to do with antimicrobial resistance, David. It means I've gone as far as I can, and I've completed the task that was set me. And then I've kept the faith. That really is in my terms, I've stuck to my values, my personal ethics and my beliefs as best I can. And now I'm off. And that is really the end of the talk. Thank you very much.